And finally, the delete statement, which, surprise, surprise, deletes a row. Now, there's much, 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 much more that you can do with T-SQL. For instance, I showed you earlier the relationships between two tables. You can pull back data from two tables using joins, which I'll show you a very, very simple example of that, but we're not going to get too deep into it. Now, this book that I'm showing on screen, Beginning T-SQL 2012, it's written by actually our very own Kathy Kellenberger. She works for Pragmatic Works now. This is a fantastic book if you need to brush up on basics or have somebody that's learning for the first time. I highly recommend you check this book out. Now, this is actually the textbook that we use for our Pragmatic Works Foundation class. And you may be thinking, it's got the 2012 title. It's not going to be of benefit to you because you're not using 2012. Wrong. So, now, I just said 2012. What does that mean? If you've never touched SQL Server, there are different versions of SQL Server that have come out over the years. The latest version of SQL Server is called SQL Server 2012. The last one, the last major release was called SQL Server 2008 R2. Now, this book, it says T-SQL 2012, but it is very, very basic. Again, like the stuff that we're going to be seeing today, it walks you through the basics of the T-SQL language. There's some 2012 specific stuff in there, but Kathy pretty much keeps it agnostic. So even if you're running 2008, 2005 in your shop, this book is still helpful for you. All right. So that being said, let us switch over to the desktop environment, and we're going to start working with SQL Server now. All right, enough yammering. Let's look at this in action. So I'm going to launch the tool, and the tool that we're going to be using again is SQL Server Management Studio. And when it decides to come up, because of UAC, all right. All right. So when we open up the tool for the first time, we get a prompt here that's asking us what server we want to connect to. Now remember earlier I said that by default, or mostly, we're just going to be connecting to the name of the machine. So we're going to be connecting to my local laptop here. I'm going to hit connect. Now another little neat shortcut, if you install SQL Server Express at home and you're doing this for the first time, let's say you don't know what your laptop name is, you can instead use local. Just like that. You have to put it in parentheses. And when you do that, that's going to also allow you to connect to the local service. So these two things are exactly the same. So it's got a different alias or another name for it. Now, the concept of containers again. So at this top level, this is our instance. All right. So this is our instance of SQL Server, and underneath it, we're going to take a look at some of the other containers. So it's Microsoft, so they love folders. So we've got a folder here called databases. And if I expand this thing, I see that I've got a bunch of different databases already installed on my instance. I'll zoom in here. All right, so I've got databases called AdventureWorks, AdventureWorks 2012, Guy Express, yada yada. Now, again, these are containers. When you install SQL Server or SQL Server Express for the first time, you're not going to have any of these guys here. It's just going to be a blank slate. So if I want to create a database for the first time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click the Databases node and do New Database. And then we're going to give this database a name. So we're going to call it Ground Zero, just for the purposes of this class. Now down here, you've got some options. How big do you want to make the database up front? If you are, again, touching SQL Server for the first time and just learning, just creating base objects, these things don't really come into account. Going to get a little off track here, but you can make these things larger. So if I wanted to make it 40 megabytes instead of 4 megabytes when I first create it, I could do that. And then you also have the other thing here. So this is a little weird. We've got 2 rows. So why do we have 2 different rows? So we've got, when you create a database in SQL Server, it creates 2 files. All right. The first file is called a data file. Now, a data file is where, when you create your objects, when you put data into the database, that's where your data goes, into this data file. Now, SQL Server also creates this log file here, and this is called the transaction log. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but just to tell you that that log file, do not delete it. It's not like a log where you're thinking, okay, I'm just logging errors or something like that. The transaction log is something SQL Server uses behind the scenes to kind of keep track of transactions. Remember, the language that we're using is called Transact SQL. Well, the transactions are something that are kept here. All right. We're not going to get too deep into that. We're just going to create a basic database here. We're going to hit OK. Now we can see that we have created our database called Ground Zero. Now we expand this, again, the concept of containers within containers. We talked about tables, right? I click the plus sign next to it, and I currently don't have any tables. So what we're going to do is we're going to be working today with a sample database called AdventureWorks. Now, AdventureWorks is a sample database from Microsoft that you can get for free to help you learn SQL Server. And all of the Microsoft examples that you'll see out there on websites and blogs, pretty much most of them key off AdventureWorks because it's free, it's universal, and it's something that Microsoft would say, hey, we gave this out here, so all the examples can be based off this. So when you're teaching classes and such, everybody's kind of on the same page. Now, before we start getting into queries, let's take a look at this. So I've already got tables inside my database, all right? And we can see here, remember earlier I talked about schemas? So here I've got a schema name, and then I've got the name of the table. So all of these tables here, chickens, database log, dummy employees, yada yada, all of these are under the DBO schema.